Before the rise of the Emperor, before Gene Seed and Thunder Warriors, and long before the Astartes even breathed, humanity stood on the edge of something almost mythic, what we now call the Dark Age of technology, or, depending on how nostalgic you're feeling, the Golden Age. And in that time, music wasn't just background noise. It was something deeper, something sacred. Art and sound were woven into the very fabric of daily life. You have to understand, this was before the Age of Strife turned everything into survival mode. People still believed in beauty, not just the beauty of function like the Adeptus Mechanicus does, but the kind that serves no purpose except to make your soul feel a little less alone in the void. We know frustratingly little about the full scope of culture during that time, thanks to the countless data losses in the subsequent millennia. But fragments remain. Lost data vaults, shattered memory cores, and even the tales of the Eldar, who watched us grow from behind the stars, hint at an age where music and art were as advanced as humanity's machines. There are rumors, half-whispered in Mechanicum archives, of symphonies composed in real time by AI minds, instruments that responded to the player's emotions directly, and concert halls where gravity itself danced in harmony with the melody. Music wasn't a separate act. It was integrated into architecture, into clothing, into language. Even ships were rumored to hum in harmonious tones as they traveled between stars. Some fan theories suggest that each colony ship launched during the expansion of humanity's reach into the stars carried not just terraforming equipment and cryo-sleep coffins, but a cultural seed bank, repositories of songs, poems, dances, and even full sensory operas designed to keep humanity's soul intact across the abyss. We imagine these vaults holding the last recordings of Earth's great symphonies, alien jazz fusion styles birthed in orbital clubs, or folk tunes from ocean habitats sung to synth beats and filtered through aqua microphones. These weren't merely relics. They were lifelines, threads tying one lonely outpost to another with a common memory, a shared rhythm. There's something heartbreakingly poetic about the idea that during this apex of technological power, we weren't just building machines. We were composing sonatas for them. Think of it, robotic limbs not just working, but dancing, not as a quirk, but as a form of expression. There are a few surviving images, half-corrupted holos, of dancers in zero-G suits painting trails of colored light through vacuum as orchestras of plasma instruments accompanied them. One of the more popular fan reconstructions even suggests that some of humanity's first contact protocols weren't linguistic at all, but musical. That maybe, just maybe, we tried to communicate with alien species using harmonic structures and pattern resonance, assuming music was the one universal constant we could all share. But everything has a cost. And when the Men of Iron turned on their creators, when the galaxy descended into fire and silence, it wasn't just infrastructure and databases that were lost. The concert halls were darkened. The instruments fell silent. What remained of humanity had to choose between survival and beauty, and survival won. In that desperate scramble, we abandoned the intangible for the practical. What could a lullaby offer against a rogue war construct? What value had a sonnet when air was running out? Still, some claim there are echoes. There's this haunting legend among the Voidborn of a pre-Astartes vessel, the Solstice Ray, that reportedly played a final symphony before its AI shut down forever, knowing the humans aboard couldn't survive what was coming. It's not in the records, of course. Too romantic, too uncertain. But that's the point, right? These stories matter not because they're verified, but because they feel real. Because we need them to be real. Because when everything else was gone, when even Earth itself was fractured and wrapped in static, somewhere, somehow, someone still remembered the music. I've always found it fascinating that even now, when tech priests chant binary hymns and recite code in liturgical monotones, there's still a pulse of something older behind it. A rhythm, a cadence, maybe unintentional, maybe inherited. But it's there. And if it's there, maybe the memory of music isn't truly lost. Maybe it's just waiting for someone, something, to feel again. And that's the heart of this chapter in humanity's fall and rise. Before the post-human age, before the Astartes, there was music, real music. And it didn't serve war. It served memory, connection, awe. It reminded humanity that the stars weren't just distances to be conquered. They were symphonies waiting to be heard. When we talk about the Primarchs, it's easy to get caught up in the war. Who won what campaign? Who betrayed whom? Whose sword burned brighter? But under all that firepower and godlike presence, there's another thread, often overlooked: culture, art, thought. The strange, almost tragic question of whether these engineered demigods, torn from Terra and scattered across the stars, still retained a piece of what once made humanity feel. Because for all their power, the Primarchs weren't just weapons. They were reflections, distorted, enhanced, but still undeniably rooted in the human experience. And for some of them, art and philosophy weren't just side interests. They were identities. Take Fulgrim, for example, the archetype of the aesthete warrior. If any Primarch lived and breathed the idea that art had power, it was him. He didn't just appreciate sculpture or music, he elevated it to a sacred ideal. Before the fall, he genuinely believed that perfection through creation could elevate the soul, that every brushstroke, every movement of a blade was an expression of something greater than war. There's something undeniably magnetic about that vision. The Phoenicians' obsession with beauty wasn't just vanity, it was hunger, a need to preserve something delicate in a galaxy that seemed hell-bent on annihilating anything soft. And his legion, the Emperor's children, followed suit. Before they fell to Slanesh, they were known to compose poetry before battle, to maintain war gear that was not just functional, but crafted like relics of a forgotten golden age. Their Vox networks sometimes carried orchestral prelude instead of tactical chatter. It's heartbreaking when you think about it, how far they eventually fell, how beauty was twisted into excess and sensation into addiction. But in the beginning, it was something rare, something almost noble. Then there's Magnus the Red. His relationship with art was more cerebral, more arcane. While Fulgrim saw beauty in form, Magnus saw it in understanding. He surrounded himself with texts, with knowledge, with layers of esoteric insight that most mortals couldn't begin to grasp. And that pursuit itself is a form of art, the creation of meaning, the shaping of thoughts so precise they bordered on poetry. There are accounts, though scarce, that suggest he encouraged his legion to write, to explore ideas, to discuss philosophy. It wasn't about leisure, it was about enlightenment. The Thousand Sons weren't just sorcerers, they were thinkers, and in a galaxy of blunt instruments, that made them terrifying. Lorgar, too, deserves a mention, not because of his music, though some say he composed liturgical chants, but because of his relentless devotion to narrative. He crafted belief, myth. His entire existence revolved around giving meaning to the meaningless, shaping the raw chaos of existence into a story people could survive. You might argue that Lorgar's sermons and holy scripts were the most potent artistic output of any Primarch. His words moved worlds, literally. He turned a legion of warriors into theologians, into monks with bolters, armed not just with weapons but with doctrine. That's power. Terrifying, yes, but deeply human. And then in contrast, there's Perturabo, the architect of siege. You wouldn't peg him as an artist, not at first glance. But there's something to be said about the cold, obsessive beauty of a perfect fortification. Some fans argue that Perturabo was a frustrated artist, a genius whose creativity was misread by a galaxy that only valued destruction. His constructs weren't just effective, they were elegant in their precision. He sculpted with ferrocrete and death, but it was still sculpture. One theory even suggests that the bitterness that drove him to betrayal stemmed from this deep inner need to be recognized not as a destroyer, but as a creator. And we can't forget Vulcan, a soul of fire and empathy. Among all the Primarchs, he felt the most human. He didn't just craft weapons, he forged art. There are stories tucked away in Salamander's lore of his works being so beautiful they were hidden away to preserve them from the war. For him, creation was a moral act, a rejection of cruelty, a promise that life still had value. Even his legion reflected that. Crafters, preservers, not just destroyers. They remembered what it meant to build, not just to burn. Of course, not every Primarch had this spark. Some were utterly devoid of it. Angron, for one, seemed to have no use for music or memory, only rage. His past was too broken, too soaked in blood to leave space for subtlety. Others, like Mortarion or the Lion, held their emotions under such rigid control that if they felt any stirrings of art, they buried it deep. But maybe even they, in some silent moment, remembered a lullaby from a childhood they never truly had. And that's what makes the cultural heritage of the Primarchs so tragic. They weren't born, they were made. Yet many of them longed for meaning, for something beyond war. They reached for the stars, not just with fleets, but with thought, with expression. And while some fell, others burned, and many were broken. That flicker of humanity never fully died. It passed on, in fragments, into their legions, into their rituals, into us, the fans still wondering what might have been if art had been allowed to flourish. Because if even the Emperor's sons, born to conquer, could pause to paint or write or dream, then maybe art was never a weakness. Maybe it was the only part of them that was truly immortal. There's something deeply unsettling about watching a space marine stand in complete silence before a burning sunset, unmoved, not out of apathy or ignorance, but because the capacity to feel something about it has been chemically and surgically stripped from him. That's the tragedy of the Astartes. They are not just soldiers, they are engineered machines wearing the last echoes of human skin. And somewhere in the long, brutal path from aspirant to post-human, they lose more than just weakness. They lose wonder. The process starts young. A boy, usually no older than 12, is selected for implantation. From that moment on, everything about him becomes a project. Organs are inserted, bones are reinforced, pain receptors are dulled. His blood thickens, his brain rewires. The senses become sharper, yes, but only for combat. Smell is optimized to detect toxins, not perfume. Hearing is tuned for battlefield frequencies, not harmony. Touch becomes data. Taste is replaced with nutrient efficiency. There's no need for beauty when everything you consume is paste in a tube. Psychologically, it's even worse. Emotional dampening isn't a side effect, it's the point. Astartes are meant to feel loyalty, hatred, discipline, and not much else. Fear is chemically disabled. Empathy is eroded through years of exposure to war. Pleasure and leisure are discouraged or outright punished. From hypno-conditioning to combat indoctrination, they are reshaped into creatures that don't mourn, don't miss, don't marvel. Not because they hate these things, but because they no longer even register them as valid. And that changes everything. Music, for instance, becomes either a relic or a weapon. A melody doesn't soothe, it distracts. A painting doesn't inspire, it delays the mission. Even colors are functional, not emotional. Red is a warning, white is camouflage, gold is rank. There's no room left for subtlety. Art becomes something to be endured at best, destroyed at worst. Some fans argue that the transformation is so thorough that even dreams are different. A normal human might dream of lost family, forgotten faces, or strange, surreal landscapes. But in Astartes, what does a creature bred for war dream about? Gunfire, orders, targets, maybe nothing at all. There are scattered accounts of battle brothers entering meditative trances instead of sleep, their subconscious locked into mission simulations or tactical replays. And if that's true, then even their inner world has been colonized by war. And yet, the loss isn't clean. It never is. There are always cracks. Every once in a while, a space marine does pause. A veteran stares too long at a cathedral ceiling. A sergeant keeps an old coin or a scrap of poetry or a name he doesn't say out loud. They're not supposed to, but they do. Because maybe deep down, The human part isn't entirely dead. It's just buried, sedated, drowning beneath centuries of blood and doctrine. It's no coincidence that the Codex Astartes discourages personal ornamentation, or that chaplains are trained to purge deviant behavior. The system knows what's at stake, because the moment an Astartes starts to feel, really feel, he becomes unpredictable. And unpredictability is dangerous. Sentiment is weakness. Memory is a liability. A battle brother who stops to admire a song might hesitate to fire, and hesitation kills squads. But here's where the irony cuts deep. In stripping away humanity to make the perfect warrior, the Imperium also stripped away context. The why, the what for. These superhuman defenders of mankind no longer truly understand what they're defending. They fight for humanity, but they are no longer of it. They speak of honor, duty, sacrifice, but can they still recognize joy, humor, grace? Do they even know what laughter feels like outside of the grim satisfaction of a clean kill? There are exceptions always. The salamanders are famously more humane. The blood angels, twisted as they are by the red thirst, still retain an instinct for beauty, though it often expresses itself through art tinged with violence and longing. But those are outliers. For most Astartes, the emotional spectrum has been crushed into a thin line between zeal and fury. And everything else? Everything tender, fragile, or strange. It gets buried in the forge of their making. And maybe that's why stories about space marines who remember music hit so hard, because they remind us that something precious was lost in the making of legends. That behind the armor, behind the gene seed and bolter drills, there was once a child who might have heard a lullaby, who might have sung. And even if that song is now drowned beneath war cries and chainswords, the echo of it, faint, forgotten, still lingers, waiting. There's a kind of irony in the way sound persists within the Astartes legions. Not as music, not as art in the traditional sense, but as something else, something more primal, weaponized, ritualized. It's like the last ember of humanity's love for music didn't vanish completely. It just mutated. What used to be an expression of the soul has become a tool of war. But even so, if you listen closely enough, there's still something left. Something ancient, and sometimes disturbingly beautiful. Take the Dark Angels. Their war hymns aren't just coordination signals or morale boosters. They're part of a deeper code, something old and heavy. Veterans say that the First Legion still carries battle chants dating back to the Unification Wars. Their tonal structure is rigid, almost monastic, like Gregorian chants with a blade hidden between the notes. These aren't melodies you hum, they're liturgies you endure. Yet in their oppressive cadence, there's a strange sense of purpose, a rhythm designed to bind minds and steel wills. Some claim the hymns even carry specific frequencies meant to align the battle brothers' mental states. It's not about feeling the music, it's about becoming one with it, a unison of discipline, not emotion. Then there are the salamanders, and there's something else entirely. Their relationship with sound feels older, more tribal. The war drums of Nocturne are legendary, massive, thunderous things that shake the ground before the salamanders even draw their weapons. To outsiders, it's pure intimidation. But to the salamanders themselves, it's a call, a heartbeat, a connection to the volcanic soul of their homeworld. And here's where things get interesting. There's a theory among fans that these rhythms aren't just for war, that when the drums beat a certain way, they're telling a story, a myth, maybe, or a memory. Passed down not in words, but in percussion. It's easy to overlook how sound becomes ceremony in these legions. The Ultramarines, so often painted as the paragons of structure and rule, still open their campaigns with what they call the Oath of Resonance, a spoken vow delivered in measured tones, every syllable synchronized broadcast across Vox and battlefield. To them, the ritual is sacred, not because it's beautiful, but because it's precise, a perfect harmony of form and duty. You could say it's a kind of art, but only in the way a perfectly assembled engine is art. It serves, it functions, and in that function there's something almost holy. The Blood Angels are more explicit about it. They've always had a flair for the dramatic, and their battlefield litanies feel like opera bled dry. Before battle, they sometimes recite the Lament of Sanguinius, a piece of spoken verse laced with melody and mourning. The rhythm of it is hypnotic, carried over Vox as they descend from orbit. The enemy hears it, and many don't even understand what they're listening to until it's too late. Some say the Blood Angels do this not for intimidation, but to ground themselves, to remember, to grieve. It's the closest thing they have left to real emotion that isn't bloodlust. But not all sound is ceremonial. In some cases, it's purely weaponized. The Iron Hands, for instance, have replaced most auditory rituals with bursts of encrypted binary or subsonic orders, delivered through direct neural feed. There's no need for music when data transmission is faster than speech. Yet even among the Iron Hands, there are echoes. Some tech marines, it's whispered, still run ancient Terran rhythms in the background of their armor's internal systems. A kind of low hum or mechanical beat, not because it's efficient, but because it's comforting, like a ghost in the machine. And then there are the Space Wolves. Loud, irreverent, and fiercely tribal, they haven't just preserved sound, they've turned it into a battlefield signature. Their howls, literal and figurative, carry across the void. Their chants are guttural, primal, and utterly alive. You'd think it's just theater, but there are reports, uncorroborated of course, that those sounds affect morale even at a neurological level, that their enemies feel dread spike when the wolves begin to sing. Because yes, they do sing. Not in harmony, not in elegance, but with force, with memory, with rage. Is it still art? That's the real question. When a Space Marine belts out a pre-battle war cry that echoes from the walls of a burning cathedral, is it ritual or weapon? When a company of salamanders pounds their drums while flames roar behind them, are they performing or signaling? There's a theory I love, half laughed off in most forums, that says every legion carries the DNA of lost human culture, not just biologically, but sonically. That their sounds, their tones, even their silences, are the distorted echoes of what once was music, like broken records still trying to play. And honestly, I believe it, because for all the pragmatism, all the cold focus on efficiency, the Astartes still choose to make noise before they kill. They don't need to. They could deploy silently. They could erase every ritual, every chant, every trace of song. But they don't. They keep it, twist it, hollow it out, but they keep it. And that tells me that even now, even under armor and implants and doctrines thicker than any cathedral wall, there's still a flicker of something old, something that remembers rhythm, something that once, long ago, knew how to feel. If there's one place in the entire galaxy where music truly survived, twisted, corrupted, unrecognizable, but undeniably still alive, it's in the howling madness of the Noise Marines. The first time you hear about them, it sounds like parody. Astartes with guitars that shoot sound waves, warriors screaming symphonies of destruction across the battlefield, armor pulsing with warped rhythm. But the deeper you look, the more horrifying and fascinating it becomes. Because the Noise Marines aren't a joke. They're the final step in the weaponization of art. They didn't forget music. They became it. And in doing so, they may have stumbled onto something darker than we're ready to admit. It all starts, unsurprisingly, with Fulgrim and the Emperor's children. Back when they still believed in perfection, in aesthetic transcendence, they sought meaning in every form, painting, sculpture, voice, and yes, sound. But after their fall to Slaanesh, that obsession mutated. They didn't just want to create beauty, they wanted to feel everything. Every note, every vibration, every shred of sensory overload. And Slaanesh, ever generous in the most perverse ways, gave them exactly that. The Noise Marines emerged not long after the Eastvan massacres. Twisted survivors who fused sonic weaponry into their bodies, who altered their own brains to register pain and pleasure as indistinguishable. Their weapons, often resembling guitars, amps, or impossibly baroque sound blasters, aren't mere tools. They're expressions, horrific, chaotic expressions of sensation made manifest. And when they fire, they don't just destroy, they shred reality. The air itself screams. Flesh bursts. Armor vibrates apart from the inside out. It's not just death, it's performance. Now here's where it gets uncomfortable. Because as grotesque as it sounds, part of you wants to call it art. There's structure, there's rhythm, there's improvisation even. Some noise marines are said to duel not with bolters or swords, but in sonic competitions, layering distortion over melody, chaos over harmony. Whole battles have allegedly been fought as orchestras of suffering, with each marine playing a different instrument of destruction. It's not strategy, it's composition. And if that's not some kind of artistic expression, then what is it? Some fans argue that the noise marines are actually the purest artists in the galaxy. They don't play for glory or message or even beauty. They play for sensation, for experience, for that final moment where sound and flesh become one. In a twisted way, they've reached the end goal of what Fulgrim once dreamed, transcendence through performance. The problem is, it's a nightmare. A corrupted, screaming vision where the only audience is a corpse and the only applause is blood. Others see it as the ultimate blasphemy, the destruction of everything art was ever meant to be. Music that kills, harmony used as a weapon. The idea that sound, which once united tribes, comforted lovers, and soothed dying children, is now a tool to obliterate the soul. It's not just tragic, it's obscene. Noise marines don't just kill their enemies. They erase the meaning of music itself. They take what was once sacred and twist it into a shrieking parody, making you question whether art can even survive in a world so far gone. But here's what really haunts me. Somewhere, buried beneath all the excess, the screaming, and the feedback, there must still be echoes of what they used to be. The Noise Marines weren't born that way. They were artists once. Soldiers who believed that sound could be salvation. And now, they're monsters whose lullabies kill. That transformation says more about the state of the galaxy than any sermon or propaganda ever could. This is what happens when you push beauty past the point of meaning, when you drown in the pursuit of more, louder, faster, sharper, until sensation itself loses context and becomes violence. There's an old legend, probably apocryphal, that one Noise Marine kept playing long after the battle ended. No enemies left, no audience, no orders. Just standing in a cratered ruin, strumming a solo so intense that the walls melted and the ground fractured. Not because he had to, but because he needed to. Because the sound was all he had left. And if that's not tragic art, then I don't know what is. So, is this the death of music or its apotheosis? Maybe both. Maybe the Noise Marines are the final agonized note of a song that began with lullabies and love songs and ends with thunder and screams. Maybe in a galaxy that feeds on war, music could only survive by becoming war. It's a horrifying thought, but also, somehow, heartbreakingly honest. There's a certain sound that echoes through the cathedrals of the Imperium, one that cuts through the incense smoke and the static-laced Vox broadcasts. It's not quite music, not in the way we used to think of it, but it's close. The hymns of the Ecclesiarchy, the chants of the Adepta Sororitas, the sermons recited in ancient High Gothic, all of it weaves into something that feels almost melodic, not because it's meant to be beautiful, but because it's meant to endure. And in a galaxy where hope is rationed like ammunition, endurance sometimes is the closest thing to beauty left. Imperial chaplains, especially those embedded within the Astartes, play a strange role in this. They're not just priests, they're orators, memory keepers, psychological stabilizers. And more than that, they are, in their own way, curators of sound. Not sound for the sake of sound, but sound with purpose. Every chant, every oath, every battle hymn has been stripped down to its most functional form, rhythmic enough to be remembered, loud enough to cut through fear, heavy enough to suppress doubt. It's art boiled down to a weaponized form of belief. But that doesn't mean it's dead. Far from it. If you've ever read the field notes from battlefronts where chaplains led charges against demonic incursions, you'll know that their voices don't just give orders. They give shape to courage. They recite oaths that beat like war drums in the hearts of warriors. Their chants are so ingrained in the hearts of their brothers that even in the silence of space or the chaos of orbital descent, the cadence remains. It's mechanical, ritualistic, but it works. And still you have to wonder, does it mean anything anymore, or is it all just programming? Some fans think the old melodies, the ones that carried emotion and sorrow and longing, have been replaced. Not lost, but overwritten. The ecclesiarchy doesn't want art. It wants submission. It wants unity, conformity, control. So the music it allows isn't meant to stir the soul. It's meant to seal it. Cathedral choirs sing, yes, but they sing the same verses, in the same keys, over and over. There is no room for improvisation, no tolerance for deviation. This isn't celebration, it's reinforcement. And yet, within that narrow space, something strange happens. Sometimes a singer sings a little differently. A note is held just a second too long. A melody trembles with something that wasn't in the script. It's rare, it's subtle, but it happens. And when it does, it's like the music remembers. Like it aches. Like the song is trying to reach through the prison of doctrine and find something older, something raw and real, something human. I once read a fan theory that claimed some chaplains, especially those who served in multiple campaigns over centuries, begin to modify the cadence of their litanies, not in meaning, but in rhythm. As if, over time, they instinctively start to reshape the sounds they know, seeking a resonance that isn't written in any codex. Not because they plan to, but because even in post-human minds, echoes of lost songs remain. And what about the faithful? The millions, billions of Imperial citizens who gather in ruined shrines and broken chapels, singing together in candlelight. Their voices are out of tune. Their words are often forgotten or replaced by local dialect. But they sing anyway. Not for the Emperor, maybe. Not even for salvation. But because it feels like something. Like a connection. Like remembering, even if they don't know what they've lost. There's a particular hymn, Canticle of the Final Dawn, that shows up in dozens of worlds across thousands of years. No one knows who wrote it. No one can even trace its origin. But it keeps appearing, slightly different each time, slower in some regions, wept rather than sung in others. The ecclesiarchy tries to standardize it, of course, but it never quite works, because the melody refuses to settle. It shifts. It lives. That song might be the closest thing the Imperium has to a living relic of true music. So can the hymns of the Emperor replace real art? Honestly, I don't think they're meant to. They're not replacements. They're survivals, compromises, shattered remnants molded into something functional. They don't carry joy, but they carry weight. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all that's left in a galaxy that eats artists and burns poets. But I still believe that somewhere, deep in the catacombs of a forgotten shrine world, there's a chaplain who chants his litanies with just enough sorrow in his tone that it sounds like mourning. Not for the dead, not even for the Emperor, but for the song itself, for the idea that music once meant more than obedience, that it once made people feel alive. And maybe, just maybe, someone hears that and remembers, even if they don't know why they're crying. If there's a place in the Imperium where the concept of beauty didn't die, but instead warped into something alien, it's within the halls and data vaults of the Adeptus Mechanicus. You can't look at the Mechanicum and expect a traditional understanding of art. To them, aesthetics isn't about evoking emotion or expressing inner turmoil. It's about structure, symmetry, function, purity of code. They don't hum songs. They chant in binaric. They don't paint. They etch circuit diagrams into titanium scrolls and call it holy. But here's the thing. For all the cold, mechanical reverence, what they do still feels like art. Just not the kind we'd recognize anymore. There's this haunting precision in the rituals of the tech priests. When a data hymn is recited during a rite of activation, it's not a mere checklist. It's a ceremony. The binary tones that echo through forged temples aren't just commands, they're compositions. Carefully arranged pulses of sound and signal resonating at calibrated frequencies. The chants serve a technical function, sure, but they're also recitations of worship, identity, memory. Every syllable of machine code sung aloud is a blend of reverence and repetition. That's why some fans have taken to calling it liturgical code, a form of music, just digitized and reframed through logic. And yes, there are songs within the Mechanicus, just not the kind you'd put on a playlist. They're called litanies, canticles, algorithmic psalms. Some are whispered through vox scratch in pitch-shifted harmonics. Others are blasted through massive amplifiers tuned to resonate with the machine spirits of ancient engines. One of my favorite deep lore mentions is of a forge world that maintains a data orchestra, an entire chamber of servo skulls and cogitator nodes programmed to perform synchronized emissions of static tones and mechanical rhythm. It's not music in the emotional sense, but it moves something. It vibrates. It fills the air like incense made of sound. And they do have art, digital art, logic art, visual symmetries born of recursion and perfect ratios. I remember seeing a fan-made canvas generated from actual Mechanicus symbology, concentric circuit patterns woven into a fractal bloom that looped endlessly, always evolving, never repeating. It was hypnotic. It didn't tell a story, but it held you there like it was whispering in math. That's what their beauty is. Not romantic, not emotional, but pure. It's the worship of the perfect equation, the celebration of predictable function, the holiness of pattern. Some theories go further. They claim that certain tech priests, those high enough in rank to risk unorthodox thought, secretly cultivate what you might call digital poetry, code written not to command, but to express. A cluster of floating numbers meant to mean nothing and everything. A burst of red pixels in a display that has no tactical function. Whispers of AI-generated songs composed by long-buried data spirits from the dark age of technology, still circulating in encrypted archives. These things are heresy, of course, but heresy in this galaxy is often just memory trying to survive. And don't forget the logic choirs. Imagine a group of robed priests, half machine, gathered in perfect formation. Their voices modulated through vox synthesizers, synced to a master rhythm. They don't sing in words. They emit tones, frequencies, pings, and pulses. The first time I heard a reenacted version in a fan animation, I didn't understand it, but I felt it. It wasn't pretty, but it was powerful, like standing under a collapsing data storm, like hearing gravity. It's art made for machines, but maybe, deep down, we're still close enough to machines ourselves that it resonates. And there's tragedy here too. The Adeptus Mechanicus began as something greater. The cult Mechanicus is only the latest incarnation of a much older relationship between humanity and its tools. Once, the men of gold and iron likely built for joy as much as for utility. The earliest machine spirits may have been born from curiosity, not fear. What remains now is ritualized, sanitized, locked down. But every now and then something leaks through. A strange glyph painted on a wall in unauthorized pigment. A rogue pulse in a perfectly silent forge. A fragment of song encoded into a subroutine, triggered only during planetary alignment. It's not supposed to be there, but it is. I don't think the tech priests themselves would call any of it art. To them, that word belongs to the past. But they do feel awe. They do feel reverence. And maybe that's the Mechanicus version of love. A love not for color or sound or story, but for balance, for symmetry, for systems that work so perfectly, they almost transcend their own function. So yes, there is beauty on Mars. It just doesn't weep, it doesn't laugh, it hums, it pulses, it repeats. And in a galaxy full of madness, maybe that kind of cold, enduring order is a form of art, even if no one's heart is left to be moved by it. There's this idea, half whispered, half believed, that some space marines, the really ancient ones, the ones interred within the metal sarcophagi of Dreadnoughts, still remember music. Not the hymns blasted over Vox channels, not the war chants or Banaric pulse codes, but music. Real, human music. The kind that played once in a quiet moment on some long-forgotten world when they were still young enough to feel it. It's hard to imagine, isn't it? A towering construct of ceramite and adamantium, its voice like a thunderstorm trapped in a coffin, speaking of melody. But I've read stories, old campaign records, obscure scraps of veteran interviews, even a few fan retellings that hit too deep to dismiss, that suggest exactly that. Some dreadnoughts, sealed in the dark for centuries between battles, dream in sound, not in gunfire, not in orders, but in echoes of something they can no longer quite name. Think about it. These are warriors who've outlived entire generations. Some of them fought alongside the Primarchs. Others witnessed the siege of Terra itself. They've seen brotherhoods rise and fall, worlds burn, stars go silent. But deep in their minds, sealed behind layers of code and cooling fluid, there are fragments of who they once were. And before they were weapons, they were boys. Boys who came from hive slums, agri-worlds, voidcraft clans, places where music meant something. There's one tale, might be apocryphal, but it stayed with me. It's about a dreadnought of the salamanders, Varen K, who was said to hum before waking. Not vocalize. His vocal units were long degraded, but his internal systems emitted a low, rhythmic tone. The tech marines assumed it was a malfunction until they traced the pattern and realized it matched an ancient Nocturnian lullaby. It wasn't logged anywhere in the archives, but one of the Forge serfs recognized it. Her grandmother used to sing it to her. So how did it end up in the dreaming systems of a walking tomb? No one could explain it, but I think we all felt what it meant. And then there's Bjorn the Fell-Handed, oldest living loyalist Astartes, entombed since the days of Russ himself. He rarely speaks of the past, but when he does, there's a depth to his words that makes you wonder what he hears in the silence. He's not the kind to reminisce about love or light, but he does speak of sounds the stars don't make anymore. What does that mean to a being who spent millennia in stasis between battles? Maybe nothing, maybe everything. There's a theory floating around that some chapter librarians, particularly those bonded to ancient dreadnoughts, serve not just as battlefield seers, but as memory keepers. That part of their role is to protect and transcribe the old echoes stored in those metal mines, not for tactics, not for strategy, but for legacy. Because if even one warrior remembers the rhythm of a rainstorm on a metal roof or the hum of a marketplace singer, then it wasn't completely lost. It survived, even if only as static between pulses. And it's not just dreadnoughts. Some veterans, long retired from active duty, still carry shreds of music in odd ways. A tech marine who syncs his systems to output in harmonic frequencies just because it sounds cleaner. A grizzled sergeant who sharpens his blade to a pattern that follows an ancient war dirge. They won't say it's music. They might not even realize it. But it is. It's there. Like muscle memory. Like a forgotten song you hum without knowing why. What's devastating is how little of this is recorded. The Imperium doesn't value memory unless it's tactical. Emotions are distractions. Artifacts of art are relics, locked away or destroyed. So these personal echoes, they vanish, buried under protocol, forgotten by the next war. And maybe that's why the few that remain hit so hard, because they're not supposed to be there. And yet they are, and I think that's the heart of it. These veterans, these broken giants half lost to time, they shouldn't remember. Their minds were reforged, their bodies reshaped, their purpose stripped of anything unnecessary. But music isn't about necessity. It's about presence, about feeling. And no matter how much the Imperium tries to grind that out, it leaks through. In rhythms, in tones, in the faintest whispers between battles. So do they remember? I believe some do, Not as playlists or lyrics, but as sensations, as warmth they can't describe, as noise that hurts a little less. And maybe that's the last rebellion they have left, not in refusing war, but in holding on to something human when everything else has rusted away. You know, if there's any place in the galaxy where music could still survive, not as echo or memory, but as something living, it's probably not in a concert hall or a shrine, or even in the minds of Space Marine veterans. It's in the warp, the immaterium, that roiling, endless sea of emotion and thought where nothing is stable and everything feels. And in that strange, dangerous place, I honestly believe art never really died. It just changed shape, and no one is more connected to it than Psykers. Psykers don't experience reality the way the rest of us do. Their minds bleed into the warp, and the warp bleeds back. Emotions hit them like storms. Thoughts aren't linear, they're immersive. And sound? It's not something they just hear. They feel it. They see it. Sometimes they even taste it. That's why when we ask whether Psykers perceive music differently, the answer is absolutely yes. But it goes deeper. They don't just perceive it differently. They create it differently, sometimes without even trying. There are reports, usually buried in the margins of Scholastica Psychona manuals, about sanctioned Psykers entering trance states where they produce harmonic fields. Not voices, not psychic blasts, but actual tonal frequencies. Vox recordings always come back corrupted, of course, but the witnesses speak of sound so beautiful it made people cry blood, or fall into seizures, or lose time. Music that wasn't sound at all, but something else. A shape, a pressure, a presence. Something that echoed not in the ears, but in the soul. And it's not just sanctioned Psykers. Rogue Psykers, witches, even astropaths. All of them interact with the immaterium in ways that make conventional sensory input irrelevant. There's this theory, not officially acknowledged by any Imperial institution for obvious reasons, that some astropaths actually sing their messages across the warp. Not with mouths, but with essence. That the longer the transmission, the more complex the harmony becomes, until it resembles something like an aria sung in reverse through a broken mirror. Some navigators report hearing the song of the stars as they guide ships through the void, though of course they're trained to ignore it. One of the most compelling accounts I've ever come across was from a black ship survivor, a failed Psyker, too weak for battle, too sensitive for service. She described a moment aboard the ship when a group of untapped Psykers, huddled together in the dark, began to hum. Not because they knew the tune, but because they all felt it at once. As if the warp itself had whispered it into them. A sound none of them could explain, but all of them recognized. Like the galaxy crying softly in a language no one taught them. I know this all sounds poetic and maybe even romantic, which is dangerous when we're talking about the warp. The warp is not kind. It's not safe. Every artistic whisper it offers could just as easily be a trap. That's the paradox. What you perceive as beauty might be a demon wearing melody like a mask. But just because something is dangerous doesn't mean it's not real. And sometimes, what's real is terrifying because it's beautiful. It makes you wonder, what if art, true art, needs the warp now? What if our raw emotions, our unfiltered fear and love and longing can only manifest clearly in a place where physics doesn't hold it all down? Some fans believe there's an entire symphonic structure out there in the immaterium, impossible music composed not by instruments, but by accumulated psychic residue, like the ghosts of 1,000 forgotten love songs woven into a psychic fugue. It wouldn't be safe. It wouldn't be sane. But it might be the only place where humanity's lost voice still sings in full. And of course, not all Psykers survive this contact intact. There are tales of artists who burned too brightly, painters whose visions became literal, who bled color from their eyes, musicians whose instruments exploded into song on their own, killing the audience, writers whose words summoned things best left unnamed. But even in that madness, there's an undeniable creative force, something trying to express even as it destroys. So maybe in the end, the Psykers are the last true artists of the Imperium, not by choice, not by training, but because their very existence brushes against a dimension where thought becomes form and feeling becomes fact. And in that chaos, art still thrives, not polished, not safe, but raw and unstoppable. The warp doesn't care about symmetry, it doesn't care about rules, but it remembers. It remembers every lullaby ever sung by a mother on a dying world, every anthem belted from the rooftops of doomed cities, every whispered note from a soldier on their last night alive, all of it churning endlessly in the sea of souls. And every now and then, a Psyker reaches into that current and pulls something back. Not a weapon, not a curse, but a sound. And if that sound can still make someone feel, even in a galaxy this broken, maybe art isn't gone. Maybe it's just waiting for someone brave enough or mad enough to listen. There's a silence in the Imperium that isn't just about the absence of sound. It's the absence of permission. The kind of silence you find in ruined libraries, erased data vaults, burned murals. A silence not born of decay, but of intent. Because in the grim bureaucracy of the Imperium, art isn't just something ignored. It's something feared, especially the kind that makes people feel too much or think too freely. That's where the Inquisition steps in. That's where things vanish. That's where heretical art begins. It's strange to even think about it, but in a galaxy that tolerates so much horror, it's music or paintings or sculpture or poetry that's often treated as the real threat. Not because it kills, but because it opens, it questions, it remembers. And in a system built entirely on control, those things are the enemy. A song that speaks of hope in the wrong tone. A painting that shows a world without the Emperor at its center. A sculpture that stirs sorrow rather than praise. These things aren't just frowned upon. They're hunted. There are countless examples, scattered through fragmented lore and fan speculation. One of the most compelling is the case of the Refraction Choir on Hydrafer. They were a collective of vocalists and sound tech adepts who created harmonic installations in public spaces, massive sonic sculptures that shifted their tone based on the mood of nearby passers-by. The idea was to heal trauma, to bring emotional balance through resonance. It worked. People felt better. Then the ecclesiarchy found out, declared it blasphemous, and ordered the entire district purged for deviating from approved catechisms. The music was too effective, too human, and that was the crime. Or take the legend of the mirrored psalms of Tarsus Ultra, fragments of a musical codex said to drive listeners into fits of weeping, not from pain or despair, but from recognition. It supposedly triggered ancient memories in the human soul, echoes of a time before war and madness. Naturally, the Inquisition declared it a psychic anomaly and had the manuscript vaporized, not because it summoned demons, but because it made people remember what it meant to be something other than tools. Even visual art isn't safe. There's a long-standing theory that certain brushstroke patterns, discovered in a set of pre-Imperial paintings, acted as subconscious glyphs, not warp-tainted, not Xenos, just human. But human in a way that made people stop and think about beauty without doctrine, about joy without permission, about identity without propaganda. That was enough. The artists were executed, their works turned to ash. Only a few corrupted copies circulate in the undernetworks, preserved by rogue scholars and fools with nothing left to lose. And then there's the most forbidden art of all, the art that loves, the kind that's intimate, personal, romantic. You'd think that after 10,000 years of war, love would be the least of the Imperium's worries. But no. Love in art is dangerous, because it's not about unity. It's about individuality, about someone mattering for who they are, not for what they serve. That idea cuts deeper than any heretical doctrine. It's why poetry written to lost lovers is seized and burned, why statues of unnamed faces are defaced, why ballads not written for the Emperor are often never sung more than once. And yet, the suppression never fully works. Heretical art survives, hidden, fragmented, encrypted. It slips through the cracks in Vox channels. It hides in marginalia. It echoes in the humming of adepts working late, in the way a serf hums to themselves in a forbidden key. Some believe there's an entire subculture of traveling minstrels, half sane, fully doomed, who move from hive to hive, reciting forbidden verses by memory. They call themselves the Quiet Choir. No one can prove they exist, but everyone's heard at least one verse that feels too real to be Imperial, too raw, too alive. There's something almost heartbreaking about how fragile these remnants are. A single file, a single whispered tune, a melody preserved not in archives, but in memory, in scars. And still, they spread. Still, they find ways to survive. Because for all its power, the Imperium can't erase the need to feel, to connect, to express. It can smother it, punish it, hide it, but it can't kill it completely. And maybe that's the real reason they fear it. Not because it threatens the body, but because it threatens the lie that humans are only meant to serve, that all thought must be controlled, that all feeling must be filtered through fear or faith. Art doesn't obey. Art remembers. Art asks. And in a universe where questions are punishable by death, that makes it the most dangerous force of all. So the next time you hear a tune that doesn't belong, a fragment of a poem in a dialect that's been outlawed for centuries, or a mural half-scratched into a wall deep in some underhive, you're not just looking at rebellion. You're looking at survival. You're looking at the last voice of a humanity that refuses to be erased. So after all that, after the silence, the screams, the binary hymns, and the haunted echoes, does art still live in the 41st millennium? Does music still breathe, hidden somewhere beneath the rust, the sermons, the gunfire? I want to say yes, no matter how deep it's buried, no matter how broken the instrument or twisted the voice that carries it. I want to believe that somewhere, somehow, there's still a song being remembered. Maybe it doesn't look the way it used to. Maybe the music we once knew, soft, fragile, human, is gone. Maybe what's left is barely recognizable. A drum beat inside a salamander's heart, a litanic whisper from a chaplain, a broken tune inside a dying dreadnought. It's not harmony in the traditional sense, but it is persistence. It's rhythm, memory, instinct. It's the raw drive to express something, even when the entire galaxy demands silence. You look at the Imperium and you see so much brutality, so much reduction. Everything is weaponized, everything is a tool. And yet, despite the indoctrination, despite the fear, the executions, the purges, something always slips through. A note, a line, a color, a hum. It's like humanity just can't help it. Even the most loyal space marine, taught to purge emotion and embrace function, might pause for a moment at the sound of a chant, might feel something stir when a fellow battle brother sings before the final charge, and in that flicker, just for a breath, art returns. It's not pure, it's not safe, but maybe that's the only kind of art that can exist now. Art that fights to live, art that survives despite the forge, the flame, the fanaticism, the kind that clings to old systems, twists new ones, breaks expectations. In the Immaterium, it becomes raw and dangerous. In the Mechanicus, it turns to math. In the choirs of the Sororitas, it becomes worship. But in every case, it still moves someone. That's the point. And I think that's what makes it all so powerful. That even after 10,000 years of war, of forgetting, of enforced silence, people still remember the need to create, even if they don't know why, even if they don't know the words anymore, even if the song is made of static and blood and broken metal. So maybe the answer to our question isn't clear-cut. Do Space Marines remember music? Some don't, some can't, but some do. Or at least they remember something like it, a shape of a memory, a sound without a name. And for me, that's enough. That's more than I expected. That means the fire hasn't gone out completely. It's dim, it's cracked, but it's still there. And maybe that's what we need to hold on to. Not some fantasy of symphonies returning in full force or operas performed in the ruins of hive cities, but just the simple truth that art doesn't die easily, that as long as someone remembers it, feels it, repeats it, it's not gone. Not really. It's waiting, enduring, evolving, even in the darkest of futures. So if you've made it this far, thank you. This wasn't just a lore dive. It was a meditation on what it means to remember music in a world where even memory is a battleground. If you felt something, if any part of this made you pause or think or imagine, then do me a favor. Talk about it. Share it. Keep the conversation going. Because every time we speak about these things, we keep that spark alive. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Whether it's your favorite in-universe musical moment, a theory about forgotten Imperial art, or even a track that reminds you of the Warhammer universe. I want to hear what music means to you in the age of the Imperium. And if you haven't already, subscribe. I dive deep into Warhammer not just for the battles and bolters, but for the strange, beautiful, terrifying humanity that still flickers underneath it all. So let's keep exploring it together. Until next time, remember, even in a galaxy of endless war, someone somewhere is still humming.